Okay, good morning. Welcome to Sabbath School. I want to introduce you to Calvin Thomsen, although I doubt there's many in the room who don't know who he is. I didn't realize, however, I'll get my phone to behave, I didn't realize that he has a doctoral degree in neuroscience in addition to religion. And he's here on faculty at the School of Religion. And he used to be on the pastoral staff at the University Church and also a good decade ago at Azure Hills. And of course, that's the one I remember, even though I didn't attend there.
That was actually 16 years ago.
16 years ago. Okay. Getting old. So this
decades go quicker.
Yes, they do. This morning, he's going to be talking to us about, I believe it's chapter 8, the book, The Future of Adventism, and the chapter's title is The Church, and that's the one that was written by Paul Landis, and you're going to be presenting today. At the end, when we're going to be fielding questions, it's hard for the person who's answering the questions to also remember who raised their hand when, so I'll come back up and try to help you field that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, let's pray, and then we'll get into our discussion this morning. Lord, we do thank you for a chance to reflect on the church, something we love deeply, something that aggravates us at times, something that may frustrate us, but something that also inspires us. It gives us a reason for being together, a way of networking and supporting each other, as well as living in your presence, as well as making a difference in the world beyond. I just pray that our discussion this morning will make us more effective at being the church. In Jesus' name. Well, good to be with you this morning. I have taught a few times here before, and I often attend here even when I'm not teaching. This summer, I've sometimes, after first service, gone home because I've had kids home, and that's when kids sleep in and eat breakfast about that time. So, my daughter has been doing a law internship in Los Angeles, and would sometimes come home on weekends. And I had more kid time this summer than any summer since they were little. My son lives in Los Angeles. My daughter was doing a law internship after doing a PhD in biophysical chemistry and realizing that chemistry wasn't her field. And so I asked her, she did really well at it, by the way, had a patent, PhD from chemistry, so did very well, but it was just, she realized that by personality and temperament, she was much more social than the chemist with whom she was interacting. And she didn't like to spend all her time in the lab. She liked to argue about things and, very, very personable and, just loves to be out in the real world. And she said, the chemistry lab just isn't it. So I asked her, Julie, well, who do you hang out with? Talk about her fellow students at Yale, and she was saying, law students. So I said, well, maybe that tells you something. Your tribe is important, which, by the way, is an important theme for what I'll be talking about this morning. Your tribe is important. So she was reflecting on the fact that her tribe was the law students, and she has finished her first year at Harvard Law School and had a wonderful, it was so fun picking her up by the curb in front of the Ronald Reagan building there in downtown LA where she was doing her law internship. And I was often in LA. My son needed a lot of medical attention from an accident. But I picked Julie up, and there she was at the curb, just beaming. Just time after time, just this huge smile on her face. And just whatever parents want for their kids, that's about as crucial as anything, to know that they found themselves. And so for her, law turns out to have, it's the right choice. She's back at school now, but it's been, but often, she'd sometimes come home on weekends and say, I sometimes go make breakfast for her. So anyway, I'm often teaching elsewhere and sometimes with the class my wife attends, but I do enjoy the times I get to spend with all of you. I want to say a word about two different people. First, Paul Landa. The chapter today is written by Paul Landa, and so this is certainly a chance to remember what I believe is one of the most distinguished scholars the Adventist Church has ever produced. I can say out of countless professors I've had, I could not think of anybody who would top Paul Landa. Paul Landa impacted my wife and myself profoundly. Somebody who reminded me of why Not everything can be done by just getting a small little group together and say, let's all pool our ideas and whatever you come up with is good. Paul Landa was an expert. Paul Landa knew church history and theology deeply and thoroughly. And when he lectured, he was inspiring. And my wife and I can both talk about the countless times we were absolutely transfixed by his lectures. Yes, there was time for questions. Yes, he encouraged us to interact and think. But he reminded us of why somebody who actually knows a lot about a subject can bless us tremendously. And why at times it's a real blessing to sit at the feet of somebody who's a true expert. My wife has 3 master's degrees. One of them is in church history, which she would not have if it weren't for Paul Landa's influence. So, three masters and a PhD. And she's kind of gone a lot of different fields. And so, like all of us, that seems to be the thing in our family. We kind of meander around from discipline to discipline. Paul Landa was so influential on her that she actually did a master's in church history because of that. So I just want to honor his legacy, and that is when he reflects on the church, he's somebody who loved the church deeply. His death was a loss all the way around. One we still feel, we still miss him and his contribution to the, just would have loved to see when he would continue. Let's see, is it, let me see if this, I'm also, that does help, okay. I also appreciate Gary Chartier, who put together the book that we are studying. And in addition to his enormous breadth of scholarship, I was thinking with some envy that Gary is an example of what I am not. Somebody who's been able to organize all his ideas around a single ideology and find ways in which all the different strands of intellectual life and history and philosophy and economics and political science all converge toward one grand conclusion, which is libertarianism. And whether he's talking about law enforcement or political or economic history, he can find some way to put it all together into one clear organizing idea. And I've sometimes asked myself, in light of how much time I spend studying theology, church history, economics, politics, healthcare policy, as well as things like neuroscience and family life and the history of family structures, I have done such a horrible job of finding one single voice, and I finally realized, well, maybe that's part of what I have to contribute. I'm a contrarian. I always see all sides of every issue. So I was trying to think of something I could do that would get all you conservatives to boo and hiss, and then something to give all you more progressive, liberal, whatever, reason to boo and hiss and say, come on, bring it on. I just want to make sure I'll make all of you mad. But because I am a contrarian, I look at all different sides of issues, and that will factor prominently in what I shared today about the church, how I critique what, some of what Paul Landa shared as I look ahead to some of the trends that I believe will affect the future of the church. I think maybe some of that may come from being a white boy straight out of Compton. And I always love to tell a story with somebody I used to work with, and I give who's who. Which one of us is grew up in the urban ghetto straight out of Compton? Which of us grew up in rural Scandinavian area? Thomsen, Scandinavia, the SEN. And of course, everybody guesses it wrong. Who was which one was whom? So it's kind of fun to look at how that all plays out. But I want to give you a couple examples before then I talk about the church and look at what has changed and what hasn't changed since Landa did his original writing. One example of how you can use ideology has to do with patriarchy. Now, you've all heard of patriarchy? And you all know that it was a grand system designed by men to oppress women, right? Well, what's interesting to me is, I spent a lot of time studying history of all sorts, including the history of family and relationships. And I will admit that there are a lot of horrible things that have happened to women throughout the course of human history because of patriarchy. But I've been doing quite a bit of study on that very issue this summer because of a class I'll be teaching that deals with religion, marriage, and family. And so I'm looking a lot at how religion has constructed marriage and family over the years, including the patriarchal elements. For much of both continental European and Anglo-Saxon history, there was actually, at least we can find pockets where, lineage, inheritances, power, and everything were really shared more equally. A lot of the patriarchal structure that began to be incorporated into European and Anglo-Saxon society actually came as people started running out of land. Economic structures began to change. And what happened before that, every big family castle or farmhouse, whatever they had only one master suite. So the oldest brother only got it when Dad died. But you could also expand and keep cutting up the family property, and so the younger siblings could all kind of scatter around to various places, and then you started running out of land. You couldn't do that. You couldn't keep doing that indefinitely, and just the economic structures were changing as well. So a lot of the system of patriarchy actually goes back not so much to men oppressing women as giving the eldest boy, the eldest brother, right over his younger brothers. And so the system was designed in order to give the oldest boy power. And if you were in the middle, he still had to kind of treat you carefully, because middle sons could sometimes arrange for an inheritance to happen a little bit more quickly than it might have happened otherwise. Just like when I was teaching in a medical class, we were talking about cadavers, and I was talking about how medical students used to obtain cadavers. There were ways you could make people become cadavers more quickly than they would have otherwise. But the youngest son generally could not marry, because the youngest son didn't have any resources, did not have any power, was completely disenfranchised by that system, so he had to become a rogue or a knight and spend his life jousting until he died young, which was usually the outcome. Now, the one exception would be if he could marry a woman who did not have an older brother, so she did inherit all the family property. And so that way a younger brother could get some power. Anyway, it's just interesting. Basic point is, history is complex. And anyway, lots I could share about gender and family structures and the Middle Ages and so forth. Fascinating stuff. It doesn't necessarily neatly conform to any one person's ideology of what family life was all about, but it's fascinating stuff. Anyway, back to the point. I'm, as I say, a bit of a contrarian. I do not fit neatly into interpretations of the church by its most vocal critics, nor do I fit neatly into the patterns by people who will say defend it at all costs. So let me just share a few things that I would note from that Paul Landa had talked about in his book, and I think that he very wisely leads off with the statement of Yogi Berra, which I would have put in even if he hadn't, which is predictions are mighty difficult to make, especially if they're about the future. But I do want to say how much I think that he picks up some big trends. But before I get into some of the specifics, my other big point, in addition to trying to look at all different sides of things, is to point out how much of ecclesiastical and church history and identity is actually tied up with forces that are both economic, political, part of the cultural zeitgeist, and as much as we may wish and believe that we float serenely above it all, we don't. In addition to what I pointed out about patriarchy, you'll have to forgive me, I'll have to give you at least one other example of that. You all know why the Roman Catholic Church prohibited priests from marrying, right?
Yes.
It's because it was dualism, Augustinian dualism, they all thought sex was bad, no, it's because of property. It's exactly the principle I've outlined earlier. They were running out of properties. And these big priestly families were encountering the very thing I talked about with patriarchy in general. Now, there were some discouragements of priests getting married. And there were some statements about how if married priests should only have enough sex for babies, or maybe if they were particularly spiritual, none at all. But the actual prohibition of clerical marriage came because of economics, not because of theology. So that's going to influence some of how I kind of update the trends. I think the one thing that Dr. Landa points out is that he talks a lot about reason and the scientific method, and I think that we do see a lot of impact of reason in the scientific method. I don't think he fully anticipated how much ideology would move more toward a social constructionist view, which is actually quite suspicious of the scientific method. But I don't know that any of us could have foreseen that at the time, just how much that has changed. But I think that he was right in pointing out that society has become both increasingly secularized, but particularly societies here in the West, in the United States, Europe, so forth, have indeed moved away from a strongly religious society in many cases. Now I can talk about the exceptions, neo-fundamentalism and so forth, but there really truly is a lot of moving away from affiliation with organized religion, especially among young adults. It isn't necessarily because of science or reason or the scientific method, but an astonishing number of young adults are identifying as nuns. Now, one of my little mantras is Sister Act was not a nun. But a nun, N-O-N-E, is somebody with no religious affiliation. So if you compare the levels of no religious affiliation, I could give you all the statistics on that, but I won't bother. Just to point out, though, that really is indeed a huge trend, and many young adults are not affiliated with any religion, and as you go up the age scale, it does, there's more traditional affiliation. Dr. Landa talks about how spirituality seems to be eroding, and how people don't have time for Bible study and prayer, and how much, in terms of even church decision-making, is made without reference to that we try to employ business methodologies and so forth. One thing I just would put a little bit of a caution on that. I hear now that in certain quarters, just hours and hours are spent before every major decision. Let's pray about it. But sometimes let's pray about it, let's study the Word, let's find out what God is going to say to us, means let's wait until God tells us what we want Him to tell us. So I'm not wanting to get up here and say, well, if we just prayed more and we just relied more on the presence of the Holy Spirit, that would solve all of our problems. Because it's just like what sometimes they say in relationships, when one party, the more relational of the in the couple, which is often the woman, but no stereotypes are always true. Like when I was doing marital therapy, I often worked with couples where it was the man who always had the headache. But anyway, just to point out that no stereotypes are always true. But the one person says, honey, tell me how you're feeling. And the other person starts talking about this, that, or the other. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Talk about your feelings mean I want you to tell me how much you love me. How you can't think of anything else but me. But that may not be what the person's actually feeling. So Dr. Landa talks about the need to both rely on the Spirit, and raises the issue of the church, how often decisions are made without Bible study and dependence on the Spirit. I agree, but I also have some cautions about that. So often I've seen so many cases in which people use that until they finally decide the Lord is leading them to what they want. He talks about secularity as well as the scientific method. It's interesting, as we look at non-religiously affiliated, it's not necessarily always totally secular. I was reading an article this week about how even a belief in the afterlife now is not always associated with religion. Many people believe in an afterlife who are not religious, and have constructed a whole belief system about the afterlife with no reference to religion at all. He talks about several things with suburban churches and some of the discrepancies. He says, I think, a lot of very useful things about just looking at the ways that the church is changing, what might need to happen. He talks about church organizational structures and some of the value of flattening out organizational structures. Obviously, that is not exactly the way things have happened. He talks some about, as the church becomes more diverse, and I think he presents a good view, but an optimistic view of how that will work. that there are some challenges that are created with the diversity of the church, that as the Adventist Church indeed does become very much even more and more international, that in fact one of the challenges will be for the North American church to maintain an identity and realize there are some issues that are particularly pertinent to our context, our culture, that a highly international church may not always recognize. Diversity does not always mean unity. Sometimes it means allowing for more room for different forms of identity to manifest themselves. Anyway, just a few things I want to say, and then we'll open up for some discussions about. There's a lot more I could build on his perceptions, but I think this overall approach to say, let's look honestly at the church, where it is, where it's heading, what some of the issues are facing the church, I think it's very prescient, especially when you consider what was this, 1996, 94, somewhere in there, mid-90s that this was all written. So certainly very prophetic in lots of ways. But there are some things that have changed, and I want to just kind of highlight a few more of them. One of them is the very interesting trajectory of American Christianity in general. And I will point out the ways in which it tends to parallel different forces in society, and there are some things that none of us could have foreseen. I know when I was in the seminary, all the books on theology of the church were built on the premise that the church was moving much more in the direction of house churches, small, grassroots, close to the ground religious movements, and how the big formal organized church was probably a thing of the past. Well, there were a few of these what we call mega churches, but nobody saw how powerful and significant they would become. And very shortly after I left seminary, of course, the great trend in American Christianity and in some other parts of the world, but this is primarily an American phenomenon, even though the church growth movement was imported. Some of it started in India. But in the American church, it tended to become much more of an enterprise. And so we had the rise of the super church, the mega church, which is in decline in some ways, but its demise, like I think it was Mark Twain who said, has been greatly exaggerated. It's still out there, and it's still a force to be reckoned with. But at that point, the megachurch was designed to be a young people's church. Now, what nobody understood is that what they confused with young people meant baby boomers. Now, I have news for you. Now, some of you who are similar age to me may not have discovered this yet. We baby boomers are not young anymore. I hate to break the crushing news to you. We're getting old. We are old, not just getting there. My aching back will tell me that. But anyway, like a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger in first one, it's, "Oh, to be back." And the next one, it's, "Oh, my back." What we did not realize is how much of the structure of those churches was actually based on certain things that fit a certain baby boomer zeitgeist, and we have what we call the pig and the python phenomena, which is this big lump kind of moving through, and what we thought was young isn't young at all anymore. Those churches that were founded by entrepreneurial baby boomer pastors are getting old. And they're having a tremendous amount of difficulty reinventing themselves, because what they thought was young was actually more generational baby boomer. So that's one of the things I don't know that any of us could have fully foreseen as churches got more innovative. What's also interesting, and we talk about how our theology is often matches what we wanted God to say to us anyway. The theology books we were reading about, ecclesiology, back in seminary, were all about house churches, that type of thing, and how that's what God wanted. The theology that was written about the church in many sectors after that was theology that basically supported the megachurch. Basically saying things like church boards and all these committees and everything were not biblical, which had the implication of saying, okay, let the senior pastor run the show. Well, that to some degree has been replaced by something called the emerging church, which is also fading, by the way. Which, when the emerging church first emerged, it talked about itself as the next 500 years. They were talking about how, that there are communication revolutions such as that afforded by the printing press. And forget all the changes in the church in the last 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. The emerging church was going to be the next wave for the next 500 years because it was based on electronic communication and social media and social networking. Well, I was saying maybe the next 5 years. I'm not sure about the next 500 years. But what's interesting there, just to point out how churches are influenced by zeitgeist and culture. The pastors who were the founding drivers for that movement were primarily youth pastors in megachurches. And they could see these big Walmartization of the church kind of things, these huge conglomerates. And they got together at the meetings, and they all started talking together, and so their theology was all totally on the opposite side, completely flat leadership structures. And of course, now we're finding all the limitations of that, which has its own set of limitations. One reason that it seems to be a rather short-lived movement, and there are remnants of it still around. But I'm pointing out that the churches go through phases, and they are not immune to the zeitgeist of the age. Let me just say a few words about Adventism and some things I see that are interesting. When I study church history, partly when I teach evangelism, I really enjoy looking at evangelism throughout the era, the centuries, the millennia, and it was interesting how much of our language we take for granted as evangelistic language. How much of the language actually goes back to 19th century revivalism. I was also interested to discover the sheer number of prophetic charts that look just like Adventist prophetic charts, but are about something totally different, that have a completely different scenario of Daniel. But if you didn't look really closely, you'd think they were ours. So, how much of what we were doing reflected the zeitgeist, the times, and appropriately so. I'm not going to criticize that at all. But things have changed. One of the contemporary trends in American Christianity right now has to do with there is a sort of a neo-fundamentalism, and I certainly different ways of kind of framing us against them. I think some of the people in the blogosphere. There are Adventist blogosphere people who are out there, it used to be the old purple mimeograph stuff, if you old enough to remember that, and they were leaving it around in front of churches and putting you on a mailing list. Of course, everything now it's all electronic. But the ones who are most vocal about decrying the worldliness of the church are totally worldly. And what I mean by that is they're doing exactly the same thing that's happening in the alt-right, in the political world, and what's happening in several other religious bodies. Moderation is taking, moderate faith is taking a blow in religion, across the board. And even in politics, you're seeing this. So it's just kind of all. So there's a struggle, and I think some of what's happening, what even concerns me in the Adventist church, is the very people who are the most vocal about decrying worldliness are in fact doing exactly what's happening out there in the world beyond. They're totally imbibing of the cup of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of the age. So that's one of the things I want to say is that we ourselves have gone through a number of the, we've kind of followed some of the trajectories that are present in a lot of Christianity in general. Adventism is a bit more complicated, though, in several ways. We have more than one reality. We have educated Adventism, which I could say a little bit more about why that in itself is going to be one of the major changes we face, as our educational institutions are in fact affected by factors that are impacting higher ed in general. And some of them that affect even more are church schools, that type of thing. A lot of them are economic factors, and the fact that a lot of who we win is different from who we see ourselves as being. It's something I also try to track is, kind of evangelistic trends, what's happening, who becomes Adventist, how do they compare to people who are Adventists. The church is going through a seismic shift. A lot of it's economic. A lot of the major groups. Adventists are among the most diverse of all Protestant groups. I saw a chart where we were actually the most of the major ones of significant size. But along with that has come some economic challenges that are going to face our educational institutions. I think Loma Linda may be somewhat exempt because we are primarily healthcare, and there are some ways in which that will be different. But that's going to affect us big time. It's going to affect our educational institutions. It's going to make it harder for them to have the feeder schools that feed people in. Higher education in general, even completely aside from the Adventist Church, is getting much, much more expensive. At the same time, the average income of Adventists, as part of some of our own demographic trends, is dropping. So you begin to see that in itself is going to create some profound changes and challenges for the Adventist Church. What kind of future will we have? Another thing we do need to keep in mind is there are ways in which certain aspects of the postmodern mindset have impacted Adventism and the context and the milieu in which we live and do our work, do our witness, do our evangelism. Paul Landa talks a lot about service, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. But our mindset has been based on the idea that if you could just convince people that a certain point of view is correct, that then they would join your movement, your spiritual movement, and they would become a part of it. That is increasingly improbable for a variety of reasons, including the fact that, I mean, look at an evangelistic title from a number of years ago. Which church is God's true church for today? Have you ever see that on an evangelistic brochure? Well, which is it? Which one? Well, what's wrong with the question, not the answer? What's wrong with the question in today's context? Do you want to venture a guess?
Implies there's just one.
Okay, yeah, it has an implication, and that there's just one, and that the framework, what we call the epistemology of it, would make sense to most people. Epistemology is a theory of how we know what we know, and what is truth, and so forth, and whatever else. I don't believe that everybody's postmodern now, but that is one thing. It's been years and years, even with many years of pastoral experience. I almost never had anyone want to argue with me since I was, just coming out of seminary, and I was prepared to argue. I could argue any Adventist doctrine. I knew all the answers. I was putting together exhaustive answer sheets to everything, and I discovered it wasn't very many years until almost nobody even thought it was a meaningful argument about which day was the Sabbath. And it's not because they had made up their minds one way or the other, it's because the question was meaningless. Who even thinks about life in that way? Questions about Sabbath in terms of quality of life, certain way Sabbath helps inform our group identity, yes. But questions about, arguing about which day, people don't think that way anymore. So I would say one of the major challenges for Adventism really is thinking through how can we offer what we have in terms of more current epistemology, worldview, frame of reference, forms of dialogue. And by the way, and that's one I think, one of the things that helps me in my own Adventist identity is I think there's so much, at least potential, we haven't always developed. But I can just point through what I call the great themes of Adventism, and why I think that within those themes there's something I think is very powerful and has a lot to say. But as far as dialoguing with other people, that's a new form of dialogue. It's something we're going to need to keep working on. It's going to be hard, but I think we're going to need to look for ways in which we can do more of that. I think we do need to. Something coming back what I mentioned earlier about economics, that I think that economic factors are going to be increasingly significant in how churches operate in terms of both even the psychology of money as well as a whole variety of things. It's going to affect higher education, it's going to affect local church funding, it's going to affect hierarchy, economic changes both in terms of freely available cash but also how people choose to use money. There's going to be a huge shift in that. and that's going to be certainly one of the major issues. But I want to, as I say, a lot of other directions I can go. I mean, since I've been spending so much time studying issues of things like family life, family structure, gender, so forth on that, it's interesting to look at the role of discussions of gender in religion. And that's an area where I can just say that people wonder, why does discussion of gender and gender roles and certain things about sexuality, why does it feel so religious? I can give you a lot of history on that. So why it's challenging? Because religion historically has been far more about babies than about heaven. In other words, religion has functioned more about organizing a family life and family structures and fertility and economics and next generation and assuring the survival of your group than it has about personal piety. And certainly about getting to heaven. Even when heaven and hell became the big thing, it was primarily as a way of managing these things down here, including family life and family structures. So religion and views of gender and family, they historically have been incredibly tied together. I had Dr. Janice DeWhite come and speak for one of my classes, and she talks about fertility in the Old Testament. We say, well, at least the Jews are not a fertility cult. Well, maybe not exactly the same rituals the Canaanites celebrated, but she talks, her PhD dissertation was on basically the barren woman phenomenon, primarily in Genesis. So it just shows you that religion has done, we all think of religion as my personal conscience, my own piety, how I want to get to heaven. Even righteousness by faith was not originally about that. It was about more communal collective, how Jews and Gentiles could both be part of the new reality that Jesus had inaugurated. But anyway, lots more I could say about that. But I just want to point out why some of those issues will continue to be struggles. But young adults now, like if you say, we're still arguing about women in leadership, they'll say, what? They don't want to have the argument in general. They'll say, what's that all about? So that's going to be one of the challenges. But the final one I want to mention, then I want to make sure we get some time for interaction, for discussion, and so forth. This is a personal journey aspect. As I said, I could give a lot of the other ideas, background, theological, historical kinds of things. I probably can see some of the limits and challenges of the church, not just the Adventist church, but church in general, and so on and so forth, more than just about anybody, because I spend so much time looking at it. But there are some ways in which that has affected my perspective. Number one is that there are people within the Adventist church who have a lot of just to dig into. Oh, the trouble with us is, and they don't get over it. They don't get beyond that. And one of my deep passions, which has always been, which has been the case like forever, which is one reason I still miss pastoral ministry so much. I don't believe the church has to be perfect to be worth fighting for. At my heart, I will always be a pastor. Somebody who sees everything from being there with somebody who is dying, to celebrating the weddings, to being there at a church social, to being alongside of people who are working in service, which is something Dr. Landa does mention in this chapter, quite highlights profoundly. That's who I am. But there's also a way, which I want to say, I think people are that way. I mentioned right at the beginning, talking about the discussion with my daughter about Who is your tribe? I don't think any of us are really made to function without a tribe. So much of Western society has been about promoting the illusion of the Lone Ranger kind of philosophy, the rugged individualist against the odds. Interestingly enough, even, I have a lot of Mormon friends, and studying, Mormonism, as I say, one of the interesting sociological aspects is it primarily represented a different way of settling the Wild West. The Wild West was mostly settled with the homesteader and the six-shooter and the, all this kind of rugged individualist kind of model. They said, we're going to totally settle the West as a group. Now, I have my differences, but I think that they were onto something in terms of saying, we do need each other. We do need a family. We do need a tribe. And a lot of it, I think it was last time I was here, maybe it was 2 times ago, I was talking about even the social function of doctrine. We think of doctrine as always about who's right, but doctrine is also another way in which people form a sense of collective family. Which means that we don't always have to argue about whether Sabbath is right or wrong to appreciate how Sabbath binds us together. And even the changes as we adapt to a world that has radically changed from how religion has historically constructed itself. Like I ask my students, how many of you want 9 children? I get to see a blank looks, no. So a lot of the concerns that actually did structure religion in the past, fertility, for example, is not the same way almost. But there are things that faith communities do, and I just want to close with this, and we'll spend some time on questions and answers. A.J. Ellis. Do you recognize that name?
Say it again.
A.J. Ellis.
Dodger catcher.
Dodger catcher. What just happened to A.J. Ellis? Traded to the Phillies. Now, if you looked at that just as a logical perspective, and some people were kind of number crunchers up there were kind of doing that and saying, maybe he's not the world's best catcher. We can, whether you agree or disagree, and some people will try to have the discussion on that basis. Clayton Kershaw cried when the Dodgers traded away A.J. Ellis. Because it wasn't about stats. He was saying the conclusion a lot of people said is, in some ways he was heart and soul for that movement, for that organization, because he invested in the Dodgers in a personal way, gave them personal identity. And I know whatever else I can or can't do, that's one thing I want to do for the church, is at least be that kind of person in the church. And regardless of ideology, regardless of what's going right or what's going wrong, I want to invest in community. And that's why I still believe in the church. Anyway, comments, questions? I know you have a way of doing this.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to pull ranks since I'm up here, and I'm going to ask the first one. My daughter is 30, and her family, her tribe, her friends, they're not as much about religion as they are spirituality, their relationship with God, and service, community. And you're right, we're still arguing about gender issues, we're still arguing about jewelry, we're still arguing about light. So, when we all go off into the sunset, do you think those things will kind of die off with us?
You mean the arguments, or the fact that we can still form community around some of those premises?
The arguments around those certain issues.
I wish I knew. Let me tell you why I'm not sure. Because one of the things that unfortunately is happening in the Adventist church is there is a kind of a resurgence of kind of a neo-fundamentalist where people really want to have those arguments and push them front and center. And I mean, for example, let's just take homosexuality. That used to be, most of the Adventist publications on the issue were relatively nuanced. And all of a sudden we're seeing real strident, vehement argumentation on the issue where a lot of the compassion has faded in certain sectors. I don't know what sectors are going to win, but that's an example of where we could end up with a more strident approach rather than a more, humane approach to some of these issues. So certain sectors, people are going to say, I don't want to have those arguments. Whether they will still be able to find a place in the church, I worry about that a little bit more. And that one does frighten me, because regardless, we have more of a history of being compassionate, and some of the neo-fundamentalism and Adventism has a harder, more brittle edge than our history would suggest. However, it is like the world. It is totally, it's like Franklin Graham compared to Billy Graham. Billy Graham was a conservative evangelist, but somebody with a very big heart. Franklin Graham has a harsh edge, which Billy Graham never had. The conservative Adventists now have that same thing, and that's what scares me.
I have seen some of that too.
At least some of them, yeah.
Especially when you get into some of the international areas.
Well, it's easy to blame international. That's another thing I could challenge. I could point out how some of the most strident voices are North America, that have the hard, brittle edge.
But I mean, in some of the areas, what I was referring to is where if someone if you are discovered to be a homosexual, you're dead. Some of the more African areas. But, okay, Forrest, and so we'll start here.
I appreciate Lawrence Barrett too. The yogi said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it.
Yeah. That actually captures my life a lot. I don't land neatly on one side.
I just came back from the union session. I was elected as one of the delegates again. I'm not sure what I did wrong in a previous life, but it was. But I really see division, and I'm not using that in a negative sense, but we still have those who don't want to let the women's ordination issue go, and I understand some of that discussion. And then, at least in this union, the vast majority are supportive of that. But however, does a church have to, or does a tribe have to have everything in lockstep in order to function as a tribe?
I would say no. That's one of the reasons why I guess I didn't quite stress this enough when I said about tribe. Why I'm so invested at the local level, because that's so much where I, even though I have not been on staff at University Church for 5 years, I'm there virtually every Sabbath because that's my family. It's my family. And to some degree, it means I have less knowledge now less certainty than I used to about kind of how to relate up there. There's some things that have changed up there that have made more of a struggle for me. Dr. Johnson here wrote a beautiful article, actually an angry article here recently, talking about some of the things happening in the church and some of the attacks, some of the zeitgeist, which I say is just like the blogosphere out there. People think it's not worldly, it is. But that's why I just say I still want to, I don't know how to relate to all of that out there. That's why I'm probably getting more and more grassroots as the time goes on.
Yes.
Yeah. I have not read the chapter, so I don't know what Paul said. We were classmates, by the way, with Barry at Avondale College. Knew Paul very well. A big question. The white church in North America is dying. We've talked about a number of things here. It seems to me that is the thing where we want to start. The church is dying. The white church. Maybe the total church is, but the white church is dying. Comment?
Yeah, believe me, those are issues as I say, white boy, roots in Compton, I thought a lot about, ethnicity and changes in the church. Some of that parallels some forces in society. Some of it, I've pondered this. I mentioned I have a lot of Mormon friends, and Mormonism is still, started in a similar cultural context and is unusually white. Adventism is unusually diverse. There are parts of that are good, but there are parts of it that are challenging in terms of, are we still that would be a whole subject in itself, is what does that actually mean? Part of it I would say is that ethnicity probably means less. Like when I used to do the pre-marriage class here at Loma Linda, probably about half the couples were mixed ethnicity, nobody thought about it, that meant nothing. But if you were a physician and you were dating a janitor or something, I mean, that's, Loma Linda, the diversity, where it got controversial, was not about ethnicity at all. So I'm not sure how much ethnicity is the crux of the issue. I addressed it a little bit more, and I probably still believe it, that probably what we need to think about is, are we creating a space for very well-educated professional evidence? And I'm a little more concerned about if that ends up fading, what we will have lost. That's well, yeah, for a variety of reasons, including the fact we are so dependent on our institutions. So I would frame it a little bit more that way, but I would also ask if there's anybody whose voice is starting to get disenfranchised, we need to take that seriously, including voices we've always said were privileged. There are times in which not listening to somebody because we say you're part of that privileged group, there are some huge things we're missing. I could do a whole presentation on that just because of the way we shut off certain kinds of dialogue. And I'm sensitive to why the concern about privilege exists. But I'm also saying if you silence anybody, if there's any part of the equation that is not, anything that's not getting said, it's going to come back and bite you. I think Donald Trump is an example of where some of the,
Okay, over here, and then Peter, and then back over here.
A few years ago, I read a book that talked a bit about Plains Indian Native American culture. And gossip played a big role in the society. It kept warriors from killing each other by diffusing tensions. I mean, there were a number of roles that it played. It appears to me that with the media now that runs with news coverage 24 hours a day, that we don't have sort of the standard story in the gossip anymore. The gossip has kind of become the standard story. I was curious if you've run across anything related to that and its impact on societal and tribal culture.
Oh, absolutely. Social psychologists have studied the role of gossip extensively. When I talk about religion and tribe and clan and culture and glue, sociological glue, a lot of times gossip has been the way that people try to get people in line without killing them. And so when we say, you know, gossip is always a bad thing, at least I have a more nuanced view looking at what gossip has historically done. I'm not trying to be too defensive of it, but I'm just saying there is a lot of study of that, how it's functioned. We have reached a point, I'd say, where just scandal has become far more important than substantive issue, and that concerns me a lot. In this, you know, the political election, which I can understand why lots of people are kind of struggling with different aspects. My concern, though, is that even politics, everything, that scandal and gossip and character assassination has gone way, way beyond that role and turned into the story. So all I can say is, yeah, I'm very concerned about that and how that's going to impact a lot of aspects of society.
You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the patriarchal system. And I was thinking how strongly it was ingrained in the Western society. Not only inheriting the land, but also going to the upper level for the kings. For example, to inherit the throne, they created a law called the Salic law that gave the right to the throne to the primogenitor, to the first male born. If was a woman didn't inherit the throne, the firstborn.
There were ways in which this sometimes happened. All I'm pointing out is that's much more complex than anybody's simple narrative would present. How gender, patriarchy, and so forth have played out through history, to say something I'm spending some time studying right now.
And
so all I can say is you can't just find one single narrative that organizes the whole thing.
And quickly, the second comment that I want to make is Dr. Landa used a beautiful metaphor in defining the church, defining as a family. And of course, we can expand on that. It's an international family, if I relating to our church. But he said that this family that is diverse should be held together by a core of beliefs. And he is giving the example of the fundamental statement of beliefs. And he's making a statement there that I like if you may comment a little bit on it. He said that basically we have to believe all of us the same thing, but we can apply it differently. Can you comment or expand?
Okay, I mean, that in itself could be a whole topic. A couple things I would just say. Number one, just in the way people think, if we think that that means all about dogma, it would be like Ellis and the stats. I mean, if we can find ways to make our beliefs things that give us experiential, shared communal identity. I mean, even when we talk about arguing about jewelry, well, what if instead of arguing about exactly where things get placed on the body, if we looked at one aspect of the text, which is about the external person versus the internal person. That is a huge issue in today's world of body dysmorphic disorder, which I do teach about, by the way. About how all of the pressure to look a certain way, how that's affecting everything from eating disorders to suicide levels to so forth. What if the Adventist Church had this part of our history and our identity is saying something about the external versus the internal person? We can argue about jewelry forever. Exactly. I think mostly we stop. But anyway, but what if we took the themes of our faith and said, okay, how do they play out in the contemporary world? I still think that in our beliefs and our doctrines, there's a lot that could say something important.
Okay, real quick, we're 1 minute over, but he's been waiting patiently.
Okay.
I want to try to be quick. 1 Corinthians 1:10 says, I appeal to you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all you agree with one another, so there be no divisions among you, and that you might be perfectly united in mind and thought. When we speak about the church as a democratic society, we need to recognize the voice of the church and let out our personal points of view and follow the church that we pretend to be part of it.
Yeah, the question is, how does unity happen in diversity? I mean, it's like, let's talk about gender roles. One of the big things, they say the two shall become one, but which one? And in British law for a while, it was clearly stated that one is the male. But anyway, if we say we should follow the church, but what is, then you get the very complex example of what is the church. At what point do you decide? I mean, I do believe there are times when we need to find ways to say, I don't want to just heroically fight for my way at the expense of community. But I don't believe that should silence our voice.